Number three, in human community. We talked last time about how it seems as if human community crumbled, and we looked at the Tower of Babel and how humanity just disintegrated here as they try to do community in their own way. But although humanity rebelled against God in the past and continues to do so today, God didn't turn his face away from the world. Because right after Genesis in the Tower of Babel in chapter 12, God gathers together a small group of family, Abram's family, to begin fulfilling his planned restoration of humanity, his promised plan. And he tells Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I'm going to show you. I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. All the peoples on the earth are going to be blessed through you. The story of the Old Testament, then, is this new nation that God creates, Israel, who God has a desire and God has a plan for Israel to be a light to the rest of the world and to bless all the peoples on earth. But they continue in their own way and continue following their own rules instead of what God has instituted, and it ends up in a disaster. But God doesn't leave the world there. Because when Jesus comes on the scene in the New Testament, when Jesus begins his ministry at the age of 30, to accomplish his ministry, his mission, he forms a small group. He gathers 12 people, representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he calls them that they would be with him and that he might send them out to proclaim his message. And for 3 years, he instills within this small group a commitment to himself and to each other. It's a learning process. There's lots of stumbling along the way. There's all kinds of problems that arise within that small group of 12 because they have their own selfishness. There's one time where they're walking and Jesus hears them arguing and he looks at them and says, what are you arguing about? And they were kind of embarrassed, and it came out that they were arguing about who is the greatest. And so Jesus sits them down and he says to his small group, if you want to be first, you must be the very last and the least servant of all. In other words, this is what God values as someone who is of importance, someone who desires to be last. And time again, he demonstrates this. You can think of the upper room before his death on the cross. He's washing his disciples' feet, a task that only the lowliest of slaves would do. He is showing the kind of community that God desires to produce in a sinful world, a community that, in a world that elevates self and exalts self, puts self under others and serves them. And he does this in the greatest sacrifice of all on the next day as he dies on the cross and becomes a servant to all in that way. Right before his arrest that next day, in John chapter 17, he prays for the disciples. And the thing that he prays for them is that they would not be taken out of the world, but they would be set apart and steeped and founded on the truth of God's word that sanctifies us, sets them apart, and they would be protected from the evil one who desires to pervert community, human community that God creates, desires to bring back that selfishness. And he says, as you sent me into the world, I've sent them into the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. And at the end of his life, and he dies on the cross, and then he rises again, and then he ascends. Jesus has completed his mission to give his disciples the way that God has given to bring man back to God through Christ's death and burial and resurrection, and then to be reconciled to one another. And then he gives them the commission: recreate this, recreate what I produced here as disciples of Jesus Christ. See this multiplied, see this happen again. And so that leaves us with a great mission. And God does this through small group relationships. We'll pick up on it next time in number 4.